But in Haiti, we just had these taxi drivers that were kind of the people that instigated this, that started the protests. And the sites. Haiti really wanted to attract this international media attention, so they focused on the palace and really shifted their target to the government. Whereas in Cameroon, they were trying to create more of a domestic disturbance. So we see markets and roads into and out of the cities were closed to kind of get more people out on the street to protest. And kind of the outcome from both places, people in Haiti were really talking about coping strategies in Cameroon. And in Cameroon, they're talking about kind of scarcity and deaths. So I'll leave it there, and I'll turn this over to Evan to conclude.
Thanks. So it falls back to me to go back out from the on-the-ground perspective and take us back up to the 10,000-mile height and lay out what we think are the sort of key take-home points and conclusions that we are drawing from this data set. And the first one is this: our data does not conform with that commonly held narrative that we started off with. We don't think that food prices lead to poverty, lead to desperation, lead to a breakdown of social order. It's not that simple. It's actually, maybe it is quite simple, but it's not that story. What we're seeing really is the food prices, or the food price shock, triggering social disruption due to a frustration over lack of control, perhaps. And this is all tied up in concerns over political corruption and probably a big meta-narrative about globalization. And it's the anger over these events which is causing the protest, not poverty and desperation. For the most part, to repeat myself from earlier, the poor people in the world suffer in silence. They don't protest. So one of our conclusions, and we're sort of crawling out on a limb here, is maybe we should see food riots as a legitimate form of some sort of social resistance. Certainly Jen in Haiti has sort of communicated that to us, where it's one of the few ways that the voiceless have a voice. And outrage over food prices gives them a legitimacy, right? Where everyone can say, oh, it's a food crisis, they're starving, they're protesting. But really it's much more nuanced than that. So it's a way voiceless are heard and their grievances get aired, we think. But if we're right that this is the cause here, then the policy response isn't to desperately hold prices low and stable through trade and technology, that narrative that Jeffrey Sachs gave us at the beginning, but to engage in this much tougher issue of political reform. So that becomes much more difficult. But I'm going to really crawl out on a limb here, and maybe Lauren doesn't want to join me on this far out precarious perch, but I think there may be a political ecology explanation here that actually exposes a deep irony. I think it's possible that the food protest, which we think is a way of the voiceless to be heard, has actually been co-opted by the mainstream to shore up support for their narrative of globalization and investment in Western agricultural technologies. So I think the real narrative is one of emancipation and frustration over politics, but people, for all good reasons and with the best intentions, people like Jeffrey Sachs have taken that and used and concluded from it that we need more biotech and more trade. And I think that's ironic, but maybe not. I don't know. It's where I'm coming to in my own mind. It's sort of where I'm hoping that Alex, as he develops his postdoc with me on this subject, ends up going and exploring in a bit more detail. But with that, I think we're just going to stop talking and say thank you to Monique.
Friday by visiting scholar Meena Krishnamurthy from the University of Manitoba. She's a philosopher and works on issues of aid conditionality and debt financing. And her talk, which is at 3:30 on Friday in this building in McKinnon 224, is on that topic. It's on debt financing and coercion and the moral dimensions of aid conditionalities. That's 3:30 this Friday. So the floor is open for questions.
Tony.
No one else coming forward? forward. I step into the lecture. First of all, let me say a comment. I'm deeply disturbed that you would be critical of Jeffrey Sachs. He's had such a sterling record in other countries. I'm surprised he might have got it wrong here. However, I suppose it's always possible. Even the best minds screw up sometimes. Thinking of Russia, perhaps. Anyway, I'm just wondering, it seems to me, coming at it from the point of view of a political sociologist, which essentially was for a good part of my career, I'm wondering how you kind of theorize riots, I guess, and I'd sort of be interested in more theoretical content around that. How do you conceptualize riots? And I'm thinking of the work of people like Charles Tilley and so on. I've written a lot about this historically, and there is a rich literature. It sort of borders on the literature on social movements, which is quite dense, and there's a lot to be gained from that. I guess some insights from there. But you say you adopted a grounded theory approach, which is like a no theory approach. So I'm just wondering, is there not some room here for some theoretical insights from some of this literature, political sociology and elsewhere, that could help inform, your understanding of riots and these particular case studies, perhaps? Just
I'm happy to jump in there if you want. Or, it's a good question. Thank you. Not being a political theorist, I struggled perhaps to answer it. I would say in answer to your specific question about how we theorize riots, for me, I'd say the most important piece of literature that got me thinking about this was Thompson's The Moral Economy of the British Crowd, which was a study of food riots from 1650 to 1780 or so. I may be slightly off on the dates, but that's roughly it. And in that he identifies empirically that there was a wide, much like in 2008 to 2011, there was a wide-ranging period of time when people took to the streets, engaged in acts of civil disobedience on a large scale, and described their actions in terms of upset over something to do with the food system. Or they targeted merchants or bakers, or the focal point of the people's anger had something to do largely not with the farmers, but had to do with somebody who owned or processed food. Drawing on debates from the House of Commons and whatnot that referred to this, the narrative around food and the food insecurity gets tied up in explaining the riots. And Thompson describes this in terms of the moral economy, and he argues that it wasn't so much that the food prices were rising, but the food prices were rising at a time when people felt that they were felt that food was being exported, and it was tied up in a narrative of trade. And essentially, people had felt they had a moral entitlement to food at a point when the moral entitlement to food was giving way in face of free trade agreements. This is one of the first moments of free trade in Europe. And so he explains riots, Thompson explains riots as anger over the trade of something that came during a point of, the trade of something that came at a point of transition away from a moral economy and into a commercial economy. So for me, that resonates with what's happened in the last 5 years. We have this big trade narrative tied up in the arguments of Jeffrey Sachs and Kalestis Juma and Robert Zoellick. We have the social safety nets that were established in the 1960s and 70s giving way to free trade agreements. And coincident with that, we have an upsurge of events, public protests, where the narratives, people's own narratives and the media's narratives and the policy narratives are all tying that into the case of food. So, I'm going on, I'm rambling now, but I'm tying this back to this issue of the moral economy that Thompson articulates in his historic study. And I think there's strong resonance there. It just seems to fit the same pattern. I don't know, Sir Lauren, do you want to?
Oh, no, well, I would just say, building on that, there was Walden and Shedd in the 90s that really were arguing about the structural adjustment, really argued that the structural adjustment protests happening at that time were really centered on this trying to kind of transition in the economy from this, kind of system that was in place that was being changed through structural adjustment programs. So we're also using literature, from more recent 1990s, and then also some of this that's kind of emerged from the 2000 8 protests as well, and their calls in the literature now on food riots that are really asking for more empirical evidence from these protests, because what people are really saying is we can only rely on the media right now and historical documents to study food protests. So let's try and get some specific case study examples of what was happening at that time.
Okay, so I have a question about narrative and your intention. Is your intention something like this? Here's the narrative that's being offered, but that's the wrong narrative, and we're going to provide the right narrative of what's really happening.
Or an alternative narrative. So there's, this kind of global international media, like Evan was suggesting, but then, when we start looking at more specific cases, these other kinds of narratives begin to emerge that, demonstrate some kind of cracks emerging in that big narrative.
Okay, so you're less interested in producing the correct big narrative than producing an alternative, equally intelligible narrative that then, by the virtue of having 2 narratives in place, accomplish something else, like a kind of destabilization of narratives in general? I couldn't really tell from your talk which of those aims was your aim.
So, I'm motivated by the policy implications of this. And I would say the one narrative, that mainstream narrative, has very direct, obvious policy ramifications, which I, to some extent, think will make the world a material better place in some regards, but I don't think it's going to accomplish the stated aims of it. Because when you actually crack into the evidence for what the links are, it's a whole bunch of different mechanisms. It's not the mechanism that is presented as the cause of the food riot is not in the mainstream narrative is not the mechanism that we're finding in this comparative study. And so the policy implications you draw from these narratives are very, very different. And if we want to prevent events like this from happening again, or we want to reduce the likelihood of an extension of the global food crisis, as it's called, then we better understand the mechanisms properly, which means getting the narrative right.
So your answers are different, though.
Yeah, but we're different people. Supervisor and PhD student, we're allowed to have different opinions.
No, I know, but
mine's right. But
but there are very different political implications attached to either of those aims.
Sure.
Well, I was wondering how it is that you conceive of the work, because they're very different. Like one is to destabilize a major narrative.
That's not mine. No, I'm kind of more on Evan's side. I'm not destabilizing.
But your answer saying that, but there are alternative narratives,
Mm-hmm.
is a different thing than saying there is an alternative that's the right narrative.
I don't think we're really suggesting that there's one that's correct. I think we're just suggesting that when we look at these specific cases in different cities, that the others' narratives start to emerge, that when we have this overarching narrative, that these start to kind of, show cracks in this large meta-narrative. So then, kind of diversity of cases. Really.
Lauren's being nice and sensitive here. I'm going to take a stronger opinion. I think there is a need for, and this gets back to Tony's point, a better theorizing of these issues, a better articulation of the mechanisms, and as a result, if we subscribe to the idea of evidence-based policy, we are contributing to the evidence that should translate into better policy. And I don't see that happening in the current way these food riots are described. So I'm taking a much more, head-on, bull in a china shop kind of approach to that. Yeah. But I've got tenure, so what the hell? I can say these things, right? So you're right. You've exposed a difference of opinions here. But I'm personally comfortable with the notion that we need to come up with a better, more accurate, I won't go maybe as far as to say there is a mechanism that causes food riots, but by engaging in this sort of empirical research, and you're right, Tony, approaching data with a grounded theory approach is attempting to abandon theory and come at data from as much of a blank slate as one possibly can. So with all good intentions, that was how we tried to approach our data, with the goal of coming up with a better narrative, a more accurate narrative.